You know what kept people alive before fingerprints? Luck. Pure, dumb, astronomical luck. Because before the 1800s, if you committed a crime and then had the basic courtesy to move to the next town over, congratulations, you were basically untouchable. Law enforcement would spend weeks chasing a description that could fit 300 other people. A hat. A voice. The way someone walked. Now imagine being a detective today. You've got DNA. You've got databases. You've got the entire genealogical history of North America in a computer somewhere, organized by distant cousins and recessive genes. And yet, there are still cold cases. Cases that went quiet for 3 decades because the science didn't exist. Cases that are solved today because someone's cousin did a hobby DNA test to find out if they're related to royalty in Denmark. This is the story of one of those cases. Let me set the scene. Dim the lights if you want. It's that kind of night. Get comfortable. Maybe turn on a fan. Seriously, there's something about white noise that makes crime stories go down smoother, like bourbon on a work night. And before we go any further, here's the question that should be rattling around in your head: why do we care so much about justice 36 years late? Why does it still matter? Why does this killer's name matter when the victim has been gone since before the internet existed? The answer is uncomfortable. It's because we can't stand not knowing. We're wired to know. We're anthropologically incapable of leaving a story incomplete. So if you like stories like this, the kind that feel like you're sitting across from someone at 3 in the morning and they're finally telling you what happened, then like this video. Subscribe. Drop a comment about where you're watching from. We read those. And if you find this compelling enough to bore people at dinner parties with later, then share it. Now, let's talk about Millbrook County. Let's talk about the life before the ending. Millbrook County, 1987. Population 4,200 people. The kind of town that appeared on certain maps and disappeared from others depending on who was printing them. There were 2 stoplights. 1 grocery store. A hardware store where everyone got what they needed and stayed 20 minutes longer than necessary to talk about the weather, their children, their neighbors' children, and why people were the way they were. Eleanor Hartwick worked at that hardware store. You know the type of person she was already. Let me confirm it. She showed up on time. She knew where things were without asking the manager. She could tell you the difference between latex and acrylic paint without making it sound condescending. She had friends but wasn't obsessive about parties. She dated but wasn't engaged. Her life was the kind of life that, if she disappeared, the last sentence you could write about it would be, "She seemed happy." She seemed normal. She seemed like a person with more story ahead. August 14, 1987. A Friday evening. Eleanor closed the hardware store at 6. She waved goodbye to the manager. She drove her Datsun, sensible, beige, the automotive equivalent of a cup of black coffee. She was heading home. She was heading to her apartment where she had frozen pizza and a cable movie waiting. She never made it. Her car was found at Miller's Ridge Road, 10 miles outside of town. The door was open. The engine was off. The keys were gone. Eleanor was not there. And then Eleanor's life, at age 24, became Eleanor's absence. And Millbrook became a town that had a mystery. 3 days of searching. Helicopters. Dogs. Volunteers walking through fields in the August heat. Police distributing photographs. Radio stations broadcasting descriptions. All of it moving with the urgent energy of people who still believed Eleanor was somewhere close, somewhere findable, somewhere breathing. 8 days later, a hiker's working her way through the state park boundary spotted something in a ravine. Something that didn't belong there. Something that eventually became Eleanor, decomposed, positioned beneath fallen branches, half hidden like she'd been placed there and covered up by someone trying not to think about what they'd done. The autopsy happened in the county medical examiner's office. A clinical room where the daylight didn't change regardless of what happened inside. Blunt force trauma. Evidence of a struggle. Evidence of a second person. Male DNA recovered from beneath her fingernails and from fibers on her clothing. The medical examiner typed the report and thought about the parents waiting in the hospital hallway for news they weren't ready to hear. The DNA profile was analyzed. It was uploaded to the systems that existed in 1987, limited systems, databases that seemed advanced at the time but were, in retrospect, like trying to find someone in an ocean by reading individual waves. The male profile led absolutely nowhere. Police investigated everyone who seemed connected. Friends. Acquaintances. The manager who'd seen her leave. Construction workers who'd been working near the ridge that summer. Nobody matched. Nobody confessed. Nobody was ever charged. By 1990, the case was marked as unsolved. By 1995, it was cold. By 2000, it was archived. By 2010, it was an anecdote. And Eleanor became the tragedy that happened so long ago that only her family and some old detective, sitting in his living room decades later, kept thinking about it at odd hours. Here's what's strange about time and murder. Time doesn't fix anything. It just adds distance. Eleanor's body was buried. Eleanor's family moved through grief like you move through a house after the electricity goes out, careful, trying not to bump into things, learning the shape of loss by touch. But somewhere, someone carried a secret. 36 years of carrying it. Maybe it weighed more with each birthday he had that Eleanor didn't. Maybe he forgot about it sometimes, got comfortable, lived his life like a person who'd never hurt anyone. That's the thing about secrets and distance, they become invisible if nobody's looking for them. In 2018, the Millbrook County Sheriff's Office made a decision. Cold cases were becoming fashionable. Law enforcement agencies across the country were reopening old files, finding new ways to extract DNA, learning that science in 2018 was to science in 1987 what a smartphone is to a rotary phone. The sheriff decided Eleanor deserved another look. The case was pulled from the archives. The evidence was still there. The DNA sample was carefully preserved, exactly as it had been for 30 years. The preservation was careful because some detective or lab tech whose name nobody remembers, understood that evidence is fragile. You can't relive 1987. You can't reanalyze a crime scene that's been exposed to 3 decades of decay. But you can preserve what remains. You can treat it like it still matters. You can file it away as though one day, science might change everything. And then, slowly, science did. Genetic genealogy is not magic. It's methodical. It's patient. It's the opposite of a CSI episode where someone shouts a DNA match and everybody cheers. It's a genealogist, usually someone who loves family trees the way other people love true crime, spending weeks building a family map. One ancestor at a time. One generation at a time. Until a picture emerges. Here's how it works. You take DNA. You upload it to genealogy databases, ancestry websites, GeneMatch, the growing collection of genetic information that millions of people have voluntarily submitted because they want to know if they're related to Vikings or Renaissance painters. Then you look for matches. Not exact matches. Close matches. Distant cousin matches. Third cousin matches. Because if your DNA is close to someone, then somewhere in your family tree, there's a common ancestor. Maybe 10 generations ago. Maybe 3. Maybe last year. The Millbrook Cold Case Unit uploaded Eleanor's DNA profile. And something lit up. A match to a woman in Nebraska. A distant cousin. The genealogist pulled the family tree, traced the lines backward, traced them forward. The lines all converged on a name. Marcus Thorne. Marcus Thorne had been in Millbrook in 1987. He'd worked construction. He'd lived in an apartment near the edge of town. He'd been interviewed casually in 1987 because he was a drifter, and drifters got interviewed, but nothing had ever connected him to Eleanor. He was barely remembered. A person who existed in the background of someone else's story. And then he'd left. He went to Arizona. He got a job. He lived a life. He became someone's co-worker and neighbor and regular customer at the coffee shop. He became invisible. Which was the point, wasn't it? He became invisible because nobody was looking for him. But the genealogy was clear. The family lines matched. The DNA profile from Eleanor's fingernails, from her clothing, from 36 years ago, it was Marcus Thorne's. Detectives don't celebrate when they identify a suspect in a decades-old case. They prepare. They review the evidence. They prepare again. Because one thing they know is that cold cases are cold for a reason. They've been exposed to time, to memory fading, to witnesses dying, to evidence becoming abstract. But this evidence was physical. DNA. Science. In March 2023, detectives traveled to Arizona. They had a warrant. They found Marcus Thorne at a construction supply store where he'd worked for the last 14 years. They brought him in for questioning. They showed him the evidence. They explained how forensic genealogy worked. And they asked him about August 14, 1987. Marcus Thorne's story came out slowly. Like old rust coming off a hinge. He was in Millbrook that night. He had driven up Miller's Ridge Road to avoid traffic. Eleanor's car was there. He'd stopped to help. They'd talked. Something had happened. His version of events was vague, defensive, and contradicted by the physical evidence. She'd resisted. It had gotten violent. He'd panicked. He'd covered her with branches. He'd left town. He'd become someone else. 3 hours in an interrogation room. A lawyer present. And Marcus Thorne stopped talking. He knew the evidence was overwhelming. He knew the DNA didn't lie. He knew that 1987 had finally caught up with him. Here's what made Eleanor's family ache in a different way when they learned who killed her. It wasn't a shocking revelation. It wasn't a person who'd been hiding in plain sight, integrated into the community. It was a drifter. Someone nobody remembered. Someone whose name had barely registered in 1987 because there was nothing remarkable about him. He was construction work, he was a temporary presence, he was one of dozens of people who passed through a small town in the 1980s looking for work and moving on. In a way, that made it worse. There was no conspiracy. No secret he'd been protecting. No hidden life where he was secretly still in Millbrook, seeing Eleanor's family at church, pretending at normalcy. He had simply left. He had simply become someone else. He had simply lived his life knowing exactly what he'd done. Eleanor's family, parents who were older now, a sister who'd grown up thinking about the August nights, they sat in courtrooms and read victim impact statements. They finally had a name to attach to their grief. But the grief didn't become smaller. It became contextualized. It became real in a way that mystery doesn't allow. And for Millbrook, a town of 4,200 people that had carried a question mark for 36 years, there was finally a period at the end of the sentence. The trial was brief. The evidence was overwhelming. Physical evidence, DNA evidence, genealogical evidence. A confession that had been reduced to careful words through a lawyer's guidance, but a confession nonetheless. 4 days of trial. Testimony from the genealogist who explained how the family tree was built. Testimony from the forensic scientist who explained how DNA was extracted from 36-year-old evidence. Testimony from detectives who traced the investigation across decades and across states. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. Guilty. First-degree murder. Life without parole. Marcus Thorne was sentenced. He received paperwork and a prison number and a cell. Eleanor Hartwick received closure, a word that therapists use but that never quite feels accurate. Because closure implies an ending, and this is just an ending to the investigation. The loss remains. But something had changed. For 36 years, Eleanor existed in the space of an unsolved mystery. That was her public legacy. Cold case. Victim. Unknown assailant. Now she had a name. The assailant had a name. And that name was finally behind bars, finally serving time for something he'd done when he was young and violent and thought he'd get away with it. Forensic genealogy had come to Millbrook County. Science had finally caught up. And Eleanor Hartwick, whose life ended in 1987, received something that had seemed impossible, justice that was only 3 decades late. You've just spent 15 minutes inside someone else's tragedy. That's a strange thing to do before bed. That's a strange choice to make on a night when you could be watching literally anything else. But you're here. You're listening. And maybe that says something about us, about the fact that we need to understand why people hurt each other. Not because it's entertaining, but because understanding feels like a kind of prevention. Like if we know how these stories unfold, we might prevent the next one. Eleanor Hartwick was 24 years old when she died. That's not an age where your life is finished. That's not a time when the story gets written and closed. That's a time when everything is still possible. And Marcus Thorne took that possibility. He took it in August heat on a ridge road, and then he spent 36 years living with what he'd done. He got to have the years Eleanor didn't. He got to work jobs and see sunsets and taste coffee. He got to exist. And for 36 years, Eleanor didn't. But here's what matters. Here's what you should carry with you when you turn off this video and try to sleep. Justice came. It came 3 decades late. It came because someone cared enough to reopen a file. It came because science evolved. It came because genealogy, a hobby that started as people looking for their past, became a tool for finding people who'd been hiding in plain sight. We live in a world now where no cold case is truly forgotten. Where DNA persists. Where family trees grow endlessly backward and forward, connecting us all through invisible threads of biology. That's unsettling if you're someone with something to hide. But it's comforting if you're someone who still believes in justice. If you still believe that time doesn't erase what was done. If you still believe that Eleanor Hartwick deserved to be more than a mystery. She is. She's more now. She's a solved case. She's a closure. She's a reason that forensic genealogy exists as a field. She's the name that comes up when investigators talk about using DNA databases to crack cold cases. She's remembered. And remembering, in the end, is a kind of victory. The person watching from Millbrook County, or from Arizona, or from somewhere far away from both of those places, you carry the weight of these stories too. You sit with them. You think about them. You wonder what you would have done, what you would have known, how you would have acted. That empathy, that wondering, that inability to let a story go incomplete, that's what makes us human. That's what keeps justice possible. So if this story stayed with you, if Eleanor's case made you think about the cases that are still waiting, the files that are still cold, the families that are still waiting, then share this. Comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you know about a cold case in your area. Tell us if you believe in justice that arrives 36 years late, or even later. Because every case that gets solved starts with someone refusing to stop looking. The next video is queued up. It's another small-town mystery. Another name you'll learn. Another question that finally gets answered. If you want to keep exploring these stories, the ones that won't stay forgotten, the ones that matter even when the world moved on, then subscribe. Turn on notifications. Because these stories find their way back. They always do. Sleep well. Eleanor's family sleeps a little better tonight. And tomorrow, someone else's cold case might just get the second look it's been waiting for.